those of us who work out in the far reaches of this country and in California are justifiably proud of work that's been going on for some time in the state of California, dealing with climate risks, dealing with resiliency. But this, as we know, is a problem that faces all of us, not just those of us who live out in the left coast, or those of you who live here in the right coast, or those of you who live in between in the middle coast. This is the serious problem that we have to deal with in this century. We're very fortunate this morning to have Joel Beauvais here with us from US EPA. He's the Associate Administrator for EPA's Office of Policy. He has a lot of experience working in the agency, and I'm very pleased to introduce him as the moderator of the panel talking about building resilience in the face of climate risks. Joel, come on up.
I'll introduce our panelists in just a few minutes and get us started on this theme. But I wanted to sort of frame up our discussion just very briefly before we get started, by asking a simple question. Why are we here in this plenary session? Why are we focusing on climate risks at a Smart Growth Conference at a moment when we're able to bring you guys all together here at 8 a.m. on the middle day of the session? So I think the answers to that are actually pretty straightforward. So as Jake intimated, climate is really one of the single greatest economic risks and challenges that's now facing our communities across the country. But I think it's also fair to say, and we'll be talking about this morning, that how we respond to that challenge and those risks is also one of the greatest opportunities that communities have. And so it's a blustery day outside, a little chilly, but we know that this has been the hottest decade on record. 2014 was the hottest year across the planet in recorded history. And 2012, for example, was the second highest tally in terms of damages from natural disasters in the United States that we've ever experienced, with a price tag of $110 billion. So those are real impacts at the community level, as I think you know, and Kate in particular can talk about that. So up here in the Northeast, over the last 50 to 60 years, we've seen the occurrence of intense storm events go up by over 70%. So we've got increasing sea level rises are making us more vulnerable to storm surges and flooding, as those who underwent the challenge of Hurricane Sandy well know, and Kate and others will talk more about that. At the same time, out in California, where Pam hails from, we're in the midst of an historic drought that's having very dramatic impacts on communities across the state. And the list of these types of impacts goes on. And while we can't attribute any single weather event to climate change, of course, they're all consistent with the types of impacts that we expect to see, and that we expect to see more and more of as we go forward. So these are real challenges for communities in terms of economic development and growth and the quality of life that people have. But as I said, it's also how we respond to these challenges, both in terms of how we reduce our carbon footprint and how we build communities' resilience to these impacts, is also a tremendous opportunity. So we're really focused on this at the federal level, and Harriet will be talking about this as well. At EPA, one of our big focuses is how we can get carbon pollution down. So we're heavily involved in a series of national programs. The president, in June of 2013, issued a national climate action plan calling upon federal agencies across the government to take on actions, a series of actions within our existing authorities that can address both how we reduce carbon pollution and how we adapt to those impacts that either are already happening or that can't be avoided at this point in time. So EPA has been working, for example, on our proposed Clean Power Plan, which is projected to reduce carbon emissions from the power sector by something on the order of 30% by 2030. We've also been working on a clean vehicles program that will roughly double the efficiency of passenger vehicles by 2025 and will result in literally trillions of dollars of fuel savings for consumers at the pump. But we're also very focused on how we can work with our federal partners like HUD, DOT, FEMA, USDA, to help communities both to reduce their carbon footprints and also to adapt to and build resilience to the impacts of climate change that they're now experiencing. So state and local officials and communities have already been leading in this area for quite some time now, and that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about up here. But we know that there's a lot more opportunity for change. And there's a tremendous untapped potential here. So we're seeing changes where a transition to smart growth strategies can really have important impacts in delivering these win-win-win benefits where we can deliver more livable communities, but ones that will also have lower carbon pollution associated with them. We're seeing transitions of baby boomers and millennials coming back to the cities to looking for more livable, walkable suburbs and revitalized downtowns. And we're seeing strategies of investment in green infrastructure, for example, that can also deliver these multiple benefits. So these are the types of strategies that we really want to talk about here. Excuse me. And we've got the perfect panel to talk about this. We really want to focus on exploring. We all know that these things are true at a high level of generality, but what about the actual strategies that work, and where are the trade-offs, and how do we manage those trade-offs? So we've got leaders from both the federal, the state, and the local level here. We've got folks who have been both thought leaders and practitioners and doers in the field, and so we're going to have a great conversation in this space. I want to introduce our speakers. First, we have Harriet Tregoning, who is the head of the Office of Economic Resilience at HUD. Would you mind coming me a cup of water, please?
I'm happy to do that.
So, Harriet.
Let me do that for you.
Great. I feel like the guy who did the rejoinder on the State of the Union. Great, that helps a lot. So Harriet leads HUD's Office of Economic Resilience, and she has also had a leadership role at both the state and local level. So prior to joining HUD, she was head of Washington, D.C.'s Office of Planning, but she's also led at the state level as Maryland's Secretary for Planning and also Secretary for Smart Growth. And I'm pleased to say she also, once upon a time, led what's now the Office of Sustainable Communities, the Smart Growth Office at EPA, located in my office. So a great set of experience there to bring to the table. We have Kate Dineen from New York. Kate is an MIT-trained planner who currently leads the New York Rising Community Reconstruction Office within the Office of Storm Recovery for Governor Andrew Cuomo. And she previously served on the Hill as policy director for U.S. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. And so she can share with us some experience from New York, and particularly the recovery from Superstorm Sandy. And finally, Pam O'Connor from Santa Monica, former mayor of Santa Monica, who's been on the council there since 1994, a real leader in sustainability in that space, who served in a number of roles, not just in Santa Monica, but as former president of the Southern California Association of Governments, really took a leadership role in pioneering some of the first sustainable community plans there. So we've got a perfect panel here, and I'm going to just kick it off and get going with our panelists. So Harriet, why don't we start with you? And so our panel is entitled, is focused on climate resilience, and your office has resilience in the name. So talk a little bit about how you see resilience as a frame for organizing your and HUD's efforts in this area, and how does resilience, the resilience frame, match up with or interact with the smart growth or the sustainable communities frame?
That's a great question, and I get asked it actually with some frequency. But I'm relatively new to HUD. I've been there almost a year now, and Joel, you went over how hard it's been for me to keep a job, and so yes, so I'm very excited to be at HUD. But one of the things I have to tell you I didn't even know when I came to HUD was that HUD had such a prominent role in long-term disaster recovery for communities all across the country. And part of that reason is because of the way HUD is organized, and the agency has relationships with every state and most of the large units of local government all across the country. So it's sort of an infrastructure that's already in place that can quickly get assistance to communities. HUD has spent more than $40 billion since 2000 on long-term disaster recovery, a lot of that money immediately in the wake of a disaster is often spent to lovingly rebuild things just exactly as they were and where they were. And you can see why that would be people's impulse in the wake of a disaster. But that's often not really the result you'd want to have. If hundreds of millions of dollars were coming to your community, you would want to be thinking really about the future. How can this hopefully one-time infusion of money really make a difference, not just in terms of recovery from a disaster and preparing a community to face what is ahead, but also invested in a way that every day it makes the community stronger and better and more competitive and more diverse with more economic opportunities. So that is not how that money is often being spent. So when you talk about how these things come together, the very work that the Partnership for Sustainable Communities, EPA, HUD, and DOT have been doing together, which is based on planning, often at the regional scale, setting goals for the future that are broadly supported, ratified in some way in a formal plan or an adopted strategy, based on broad community engagement, that really look at the future of the community, including things like risks and vulnerabilities. Though that's the perfect basis on which to decide how to spend whatever money comes your way, whether you are responding honestly to a disaster or moving to an opportunity. That's a really solid basis for coming together. And I know that when we talk about resilience, we really talk about a particular focus on that vulnerability. It's a fact, and the communities, the constituents that HUD particularly represents are vulnerable. They're poor, and they just don't experience a disaster in the same way. And so we've been hearing a lot in the news about income disparity, about the growing economic disparities in our country. Disasters really exacerbate those differences. It can take years and decades for a low-income household who might have lost everything and might not have any resources or any aid that would help them replace what they've lost, to recover from a disaster if they recover at all. So the capacities that we build by planning together, by having trusted relationships among government, by having community organizations be part of the planning process, we build social capital. All of these things are also really important pieces of resilience. And I'll stop there.
That's fantastic. What a great overview from the federal perspective. And Kate, maybe you can take us now down to some of where you guys have been focused in New York as you work to respond both to the recent challenges of Superstorm Sandy, and if you want to bring in some of the experience with Irene and so forth as well, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely. So this is a great segue because the state of New York is a HUD grantee, and the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery oversees about a $4 billion budget comprised of HUD Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Funds that came down through the Sandy Supplemental Appropriations Bill. So Governor Cuomo established this Storm Recovery Office as a one-stop shop for all of the state's critical recovery and resilience programs. And the goal here, to build on what Harriet outlined, is not to just build back, but to build back better and to build back smarter. So we oversee an array of recovery programs under the New York Rising umbrella. We have housing assistance programs for single-family, multifamily, rental, and what I think is a very innovative voluntary buyout program that I could talk about more later. We also have a targeted small business assistance program, an infrastructure program, and then the New York Rising Community Reconstruction Program, which I directly oversee and can speak more about there. But we're still in the midst of recovery, and we are not only serving Sandy-impacted communities. Superstorm Sandy devastated our downstate communities in New York City and Long Island in 2012. But we were also hit by two storms upstate, Irene and Lee, just a year prior. So we have communities both downstate dealing with coastal vulnerabilities and upstate with similar riverine vulnerabilities who are in various states of recovery. So we oversee a wide geography with a diversity of needs. And we've learned some critical lessons along the way. I think we've really benefited from the governor's decision to centralize the recovery effort and also to integrate recovery and resiliency into the fabric of the administration outside of the recovery shop. So our state agencies are very much focused on integrating and promoting resiliency and the work that they've been doing. In particular, our State Department of Environmental Conservation and our State Department of State, where the majority of our planners sit, are working very hard. We have an exciting new bill that passed earlier this year, the Community Risk and Resilience Act, that charges state agencies with considering climate change risks from storm surge and sea level rise in their permitting and regulatory decisions, and that does include smart growth assessments. So the governor, I think, has done a really commendable job of not only spearheading this recovery effort, but integrating resilience into the fabric of the administration and the goals of the administration. And you know, aside from that kind of the logistical setup of lessons learned in terms of, you know, centralization and integration, I think what I've really learned so far is the need to empower our most impacted and vulnerable communities to really have a seat at the table and to be able to influence their immediate recovery, but also to craft a vision for a longer term resilient future. And that's really what we've endeavored to do with the Community Reconstruction Program. It's a $700 million planning effort. I think arguably one of the more robust and ambitious participatory recovery and resiliency planning efforts, and to really distill and simplify the process, you know, much to the disdain of my colleagues. What we've done is we've identified the most vulnerable, most impacted communities throughout the state. We've gone in at the local level and established planning committees comprised of very local leaders, generally not elected officials, but small business owners, homeowners, community board members. And we've empowered them with some of the most skilled practitioners in planning, economic development, urban design, engineering, and we've led them through a rigorous 8-month planning process that starts with acknowledging and documenting the storm impacts, but then developing a vision statement for their community that addresses short, medium, and long-term recovery and resilience needs. And, you know, we started out by identifying community assets, and then confronting the very real risks to those assets, which include climate change projections, and then identifying needs and opportunities, reconstruction and resiliency strategies, and then ultimately projects which the state has set funding aside from that $4 billion CDBG-DR bucket to fund HUD-eligible projects. So we've racked up this planning process now in 61 different planning areas throughout the state. It's been a Herculean effort, largely shouldered by these community volunteers who comprise the planning committees, and I think we have work that everyone is really proud of. You can go on our website and see all of our community reconstruction plans. The planners in the room, I think, will appreciate the technical rigor of some of these documents. And now the state is in the process with working with local municipalities and eligible nonprofits to implement the projects that were conceived of by these communities. So they really run the gamut and take a holistic approach to proposing projects that increase a community's physical resilience, but also their social and economic resilience. So I think later we can talk about some of the specific projects that are proposed that particularly focus on that economic aspect, but it's a really exciting time for us and for these vulnerable communities who are seeing their vision realized.
That's fantastic, and let's definitely circle back to some of the substance there. But I want to give Pam a chance to jump in here. So Santa Monica has been, you know, really a leader in this space on sustainability. for example, I gather that Santa Monica has a rather ambitious carbon reduction goal, this 15 by 15 goal of getting to 15% below 1990 emissions by 2015, which is this year. So I think we'd just be really interested to hear how Santa Monica has really been able to prioritize this focus over a pretty sustained period here, and what some of the perspectives are that brings to this group.
Well, first of all, I was going to mention that recently I got appointed to the state committee, and I was sitting at the meeting on Friday, looked around the dais, and I did tell the group that committee was going to be known as Pam and the Boys, because it was me and all guys. So I'm really happy that this panel is Joel and the women. Very, very pleased, but we're glad to have you up here, Joel. But in Santa Monica, back in the day, 20 years ago, actually, 21, almost 1994, the city adopted its first sustainable city plan, and that's evolved over the years. And there's a real tide to resilience now that's come in. And so the resilience of today is both in terms of how do you build that physical infrastructure that is resilient, but also how do you build that capacity within people that's resilient. So we were lucky enough to get a Bloomberg Foundation innovation grant to develop a well-being index. And we're at the very beginnings of that. And that, again, is about how to, and the individual community member, what are the gaps, where can we use government resources to fill in the kinds of things that government can do and the services that can be provided to build that community resilience. And I mention that because where we are on our well-being plan right now is where we were 20 years ago with our sustainable city plan. And it keeps building on it. Our sustainable city plan initially, it was based on natural resources, evaluation of that and setting the goals and greenhouse gas reductions. And that has evolved now to include other dimensions, including housing, civic engagement, human dignity. So again, all those pieces coming together. But still, at the core of it and at the crux of it, and as a city government and municipal operation and leading the community, is what do we do with those natural resources? What do we do with our behaviors and actions to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions? So we set the targets. We set the target for 2015, which is suddenly here, to reduce by 15%. We're at 14%. And we have put together what we did about 2 or 3 years ago, put together a climate action plan, which was a short-term plan. We have a long-term. We're working on the next iteration of the long-term plan. And you need those just as our overarching sustainable city plan is needed to give you that vision, to give you those long-term goals. But you can't just rely on looking at that long term. Having our 15 by 15 actions we could take by 2015 to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to get to this goal is that short-term action plan. So having those action plans in place. So we're on target now to reach that. Some of the things, though, that to look back to what got us started is there were groups like ICLEI that provided technical assistance. We were part of the Climate Action Plan, and that helped to provide and build capacity within our staff on the technical side. Not every, you're there in city government, you're not necessarily there to measure greenhouse gas reductions. So you need that kind of help, the technical assistance. We've got that going. We've also, as we have the Sustainable City Plan, we regularly report back to the community on it, and I can tell you a bit more about that either now or I guess I'll wait till later to tell you a little bit more about that. But again, setting those goals and having regular measurement and regular reporting is critical. But I think the most exciting thing I'll end on here is how we are merging that Sustainable City Plan with the evolution of the Well-Being Index. Again, bringing that, how do we live? How we live and how we act and how we behave impacts greenhouse gas reductions in many ways and builds, again, both that community resilience in terms of infrastructure and combined, though, with what we're all here about is how to build that resilience so that people have places and opportunities to have great lives.
That's fantastic. Well, I think that's a great stage setter. I'm really struck in listening to the three panelists by the different kind of roles and opportunities that each of the three levels of government, has to have an impact on this. But I can imagine it isn't always, sort of simple or easy to mesh those roles and integrate them to really synergize them. And I'm wondering if the three of you could just reflect a little, at least briefly, on where you see each of the three levels of government having its comparative advantage in this sustainability and resilience space, and some concrete examples of where maybe that's gone really right, or where there have been some real challenges that have been learning opportunities for us. So I don't know if...
Want to start
yeah,
in the reverse order?
Yeah, why don't we start the reverse order? Pam, do you want to take a crack at that first?
Okay, so, well, local governments, and it depends on your size. The city of Los Angeles, big, 4 million people, huge bureaucracy, and they're doing exciting things. Don't get me wrong, they're great. They're the center of our universe in a way. But we have 88 other cities in Los Angeles County, much less 194 in our region. So we're of various sizes. And Santa Monica, as a kind of middling-sized city, we're about 90,000 people. We're surrounded on three sides by Los Angeles, and as I like to say, our escape route is the Pacific Ocean. But we do love L.A. But being that we're a smaller organization, we can be more nimble about trying pilot programs. And I think the pilot program, trying pilots, is really critical. As the parklets out there show us that sometimes, you can't always embark upon that grandiose plan to get the resource to put something, say a parklet on every block would be impossible. But one can start by saying, okay, we're going to do the pilot, we're going to try this out. So we've taken some big steps, we've taken some little steps along the way, and they build on each other. One of the things that we did, again, being a smaller government back in 1999, we were able to say, we are going to commit for city operations to buy our energy from renewable energy sources. So again, it might have been harder to do if we were a larger organization, but we could do that. And we're also lucky in that we do have a community, being that we are on the edge of the Pacific Ocean, that is open to environmental sustainability, because we see that ocean, that coastline is our front door, our front yard. So again, trying those pilots. We're embarking on things that have been done elsewhere. The bike share, we're getting bike share going right now in Santa Monica. And while it's been done elsewhere, it's been a little hard to get done in the Los Angeles area. We've had some bumps in the road. We're trying to get off a bigger program in Los Angeles that didn't quite take shape. So Santa Monica, we were able to finally say, we're not going to wait anymore. We're going to cobble together and find the resources, get the grants that we were lucky enough that they were out there to put together the bike share program, that we're going to be the first ones in Southern California, which makes it exciting, get bike share going. And that will connect with the light rail line that's happening. So again, looking at those opportunities, looking at actually the funding that has come from the federal government on the sustainability and linking land use, transportation, and environment has helped us do longer-term specific planning for our areas. And this also ties into so at the smaller local level, being nimble and taking advantage of those kinds of grants helps. But not every city has the capacity within the city to be able to spend the time it takes, those extra hours, to apply for that or to find that opportunity. So that's where organizations like the Southern California Association of Governments, the MPOs, the Metropolitan Planning Organizations, they come to play too. And SCAG, as it's known, has now a green cities program that will provide that technical assistance to cities, the smaller cities who might not have that same capacity and time to be able to put it together, to help them put together those kinds of planning, those kinds of small programs that can take them to the next level in their city. So again, being nimble, sharing information, putting together through things like the MPO that toolkit of what has worked, what other cities have done, and then having the opportunity to fund these small planning grants and small pilot programs, again, helps to incentivize and energize and just keep growing it step by step. But that's, when you're a baby, you do it step by step and you grow.
Kate, you want to jump in on that?
So I'm clearly biased, but I think that the state sits in the sweet spot, literally, between local governments and the federal government. And I've been lucky enough to work with Governor Cuomo, and it's been a priority of the administration to consolidate and streamline government bureaucracy to ensure that the state's able to operate in that more nimble capacity. So in the case of the Community Reconstruction Program, we have received this sizable federal grant from the Sandy Supplemental through HUD, and we're very lucky in that this particular funding source, CDBG DR dollars, within the eligibility constraints is rather flexible, and the state has a fair amount of discretion in how we want to program that funding. As long as we can communicate to HUD that we're serving vulnerable populations, we're thinking in a creative, responsible way about meeting our unmet recovery needs, then we do have a lot of latitude to craft innovative programs that can do just that can help with catalyze the longer-term recovery of our state's most vulnerable communities. So, what we're doing is receiving this federal grant, programming the money, but then in some cases, with the Community Reconstruction Program, we're sub-granting that money on to what we call subrecipients. And in the near term, those subrecipients are local municipalities. They might be a county, a town, a city, in some cases a village. And what's great about that is being able to transfer knowledge and build capacity at the most local level, to pass that on to the municipality itself, who is that subrecipient. And we really feel that mirrors the planning process itself. This was community-driven and grassroots, and the implementation strategy should mirror that. It shouldn't be top-down unless when it's really appropriate. So I think, the state of New York is in a terrific position right now because we do have the capacity and resources to draw upon and are given a certain degree of freedom in programming our federal grants and working with the municipalities to implement projects and programs.
I could arbitrate on this one and say which really is the best government. But I will say, and what is certainly represented on this panel with Joel and Kate and Mayor O'Connor, that leadership is the single most important ingredient, right? That the level of government doesn't matter if you don't really have outstanding leadership. And I know all of us have either had the experience of working for outstanding leaders or having a chance to show leadership ourselves and also being in the opposite position, where it was really almost impossible to move something. So leadership makes a huge difference. And it's great to see what people can do with that opportunity. I totally agree with what my colleagues have said. Local government is the closest to the action, can absolutely be innovative. Pilot is a magic word. Temporary is a magic word. But you know what is hard about this kind of work when we're talking about climate? A lot of the impacts that we're planning for, preparing for, adapting to are in the future. The most drastic impacts are in the future. Some things are already happening now, but the future is sometimes hard, especially for elected officials to deal with. I think local government also does the very best job of setting things in motion today that have great future benefits, but that also deliver benefits today. And I think that is an important component of this, that you can't say, yes, we're making this investment and your grandchildren will benefit, but we'll just pay until then. I think it's important that we have those short-term benefits as well. States are great setters of rules that are very important. One of the great things that Maryland did was use the state infrastructure money to really enforce policies around where growth is better and worse. And I think that what New York is doing with this hopefully one-time really large infusion of money, I even love the name New York Rising, right? It's about a long-term strategy that will help the communities that are participating be better in every way, not just recovered from their disaster. And I think capacity is huge. So what New York State is doing, Maryland had a circuit rider program that sent planners temporarily to small communities in the state to help them do the planning that was necessary for them to really seize the reins of their own future. So I think that's a great role for states to organize. And you were so great, Mayor O'Connor, to bring in the regional element, because that's not an official level of government in most parts of the country, but it's the scale at which so many important things happen. It's the scale of our economy. It's the scale of our housing market. It's the scale of many of our environmental problems. It's the scale of our transportation systems. And so that same role that can be local, can be state, providing that capacity, sharing best practices. I also love how competitive cities are with each other, which I think other units of government are not nearly as competitive. And that's actually a way to fuel and accelerate the pace of change. They love to be first to do something wonderful, and they love to steal. That's the highest compliment, to steal someone else's good idea and implement it in their community. So I love that about local government. And I would say the federal role is really an evolving one. I have really come to see federal money as needing to be catalytic. You know, federal dollars are not going to be the 100% solution like they might have been in the past, but whether we're using those dollars to invest in regional plans or community plans around the country, what that stimulates is an amazing set of outcomes, but it's catalytic. The transportation money is no longer the only thing that's going into transit projects, you know, not by a long shot in many cases, but it can really, the competition for the dollars themselves can be hugely catalytic. You talk about bike share. In the District of Columbia, we put together a regional bike share program with the promise of Tiger money. It was the first Tiger grant that was offered, and we put together an amazing application that was multi-county. We got everybody very excited about it. It was going to be really big, and they didn't fund it. The federal government said that seems kind of a frivolous thing to maybe do, bike share. Who's going to use that? So they didn't fund it. But you know what? We'd already organized ourselves. We'd already gotten our citizens excited across the region, and it wasn't that expensive in the scheme of things, so we did it without it. And I give the Tiger competition full credit for stimulating, for catalyzing the effort that brought us bike share, even though they gave us not $1 to do it in that Tiger round. And I think that's a great role for the federal government, as well as catalyzing, but also convening. We have some amazing partnerships that we're taking on tough topics. So, you know, one of the things that our office is doing now is $1 billion national disaster resilience competition. And one of the coolest things about it is that we're partnering with the Rockefeller Foundation. They're putting $5 million into just the first 6 months of the competition to basically work with states and localities across the country to help them, you know, imagine a more resilient future, very broadly doing that, so that whether the applicants win or lose the competition, they'll have a product that works for their community, because $1 billion seems like a lot of money, but it's chump change compared to the billions that are spent every year by states and localities. Water and sewer, roads and bridges, parks, buildings, open space, most of it now spent without any thought to resilience. That's the real money. And the $1 billion is just a carrot to try to get people interested in having this broader conversation. So I think that's also a really important role for the federal government, to help convene, to help bring new partners and resources to the table, and really help at scale try to get people to think differently about how we do business.
That's great. So each of the two of you, Kate and Harriet, are involved in one way, directly or indirectly, giving out money to help communities to become more resilient. So, you know, what does success look? What are the metrics that you would use in the National Disaster Resilience Competition, or Kate, that your office and other offices within the governor's office would use to think about how do we know if this money has been well spent? How do we define resilience in a way that we can actually, you know, look at whether we've succeeded?
I think some of it is the actual projects themselves. I mean, I ask myself, why would we ever build another berm or levee if a waterfront park would provide the same level of flood protection? Mm-hmm. And that park gets used every day, right? So thinking about the set of benefits that get produced from the investment and really trying to maximize that money and be much smarter about how it's used. I think also who are the partners in the process, right? Like, so how many stakeholders have you been able to engage? But also, if you have a really robust set of resilience investments that give you multiple benefits, there are also probably multiple funding streams, mm-hmm. local revenues, state revenues. Maybe people will vote to for a special assessment to fund something that they see as really worthwhile. So it makes it much more likely that it'll happen, that it's much more robust. but I think that part of it is also being able to, build one project and meet environmental objectives and transportation objectives, resilience objectives, employment objectives, economic diversity objectives. So that is so not how most of our infrastructure projects are currently being framed or designed or planned or funded. So I think we have a long way to go. So any movement along that trajectory, I think we would call successful. And I'd be really interested in what Kate has to say.
So I totally agree that it's all about shepherding, championing projects that have multiple co-benefits. And we've been lucky enough through this community-based planning process, we provided the planning committees comprised of volunteer citizens with experts who really help them push the envelope. The whole thought behind this community-driven planning process is simple. It's the community members themselves that understand their community's unique assets and the equally unique risks to those assets on a very organic level. But we provided the expertise to help these committees understand that from a technical perspective and then to develop projects that do achieve multiple co-benefits and really impress upon communities to think about resilience in a very comprehensive, holistic way. Not just physical resilience, again, but also social and economic resilience. And I mean, the results of this discourse, I think, have been incredibly heartening for a planner to see happen. Communities that started this process thinking about berms and walls are now championing nature-based features. So it really shows an evolution, and a fantastic byproduct of this planning process is now that we have very well-educated citizens in vulnerable populations who are now thinking way outside of the box. Another neat thing that has happened in the recovery effort is that the state has been lucky enough to receive funding to implement 2 Rebuild by Design projects from HUD. So these projects came out of this. I think many are familiar with this competition that Harriet can speak to much more eloquently than I. But world-renowned planners were brought together and came up with these scalable, innovative projects throughout the Sandy-impacted region, and we'll be implementing 2. One is off the coast of Staten Island that is a living, growing breakwaters project. So when you talk about multiple co-benefits, we're using oysters to not only physically grow a breakwater that will offer wave attenuation, but also to filter the water and include social resilience benefits for adjacent communities and schools who can help cultivate the oysters, learn about the benefits. There could be ecotourism opportunities, and we're just at the very beginning stages of developing and releasing our draft EIS on this process, but it's a $60 million project that I think HUD has very smartly can I say forced, Harriet? To leverage additional funding sources. We encouraged. We have received $60 million to start to tackle this project, but we need to leverage other funding sources as the state to really bring this to fruition, to see that all these co-benefits are met. So that's thinking really strategically about private-public partnerships, engagement of multiple stakeholder groups, including academic institutions and think tanks. So this grew out of this, I think, very robust competition that did just that in terms of stakeholder engagement. And we're implementing a similar project in Nassau County and Staten Island along the Mill River. So it's a totally different context, but has equally, I think, innovative co-benefits. So we're really thrilled to be tapped to execute these projects.
Pam, have you, as you've worked in this space, have you found that there are trade-offs or challenges at all? When you're looking at reducing carbon footprint on the one hand and looking at building resilience to future impacts, and it's great when it's a happy story and it comes together and the right project to do for resilience purposes also delivers, sort of these sustainability benefits. But surely that's not always the case. Have you encountered tensions in that space at all? Or have you found that there's usually a pretty good harmony and synergy here?
Well, it's interesting. As you all were talking, I was thinking, too, about the concept of, as Harriet was saying, you need leadership. As Kate was saying, too, you also need the constituents, and you need them to come together. And having been around for a couple decades now, and on Santa Monica's council, but also in the Los Angeles region, I was thinking about we're talking the biking and the bike share and how that has evolved in my region. And part of it is the long-term kinds of actions. So 25 years ago, if you were in Southern California, you would very often get warnings that it was a day where the air quality was so poor that you were told, keep your kids inside, no, don't do any vigorous activities, elderly folks, be careful. So who would get on their bike and ride in that situation? So California, the AQMD, the Air Quality Management District of Southern California, the air regulations, the things mandated by the federal government, which, helped, clean up your air. We, along the way, is even businesses and folks in Santa Monica, you'd hear kind of grumbling. But we still, through that tension, that give and take of regulations, people fighting some getting in place. But over the years, that air is cleaner now. We don't have those warnings. And now people say, I want to bike because it's a great climate, I want to bike. We still help, so that has now set this platform for people to be able to want to bike in the Southern California area. Again, we have great traffic congestion, so biking helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It helps with people having other mobility choices. But you do still have some folks who say, oh, that bike lane, it's going to obstruct traffic. I hear other parts of the country, it's even worse, kind of people coming to head together on that. But you have that. However, what we've seen in Santa Monica is that if you build it, they will come in terms of the bikers and bicyclists. And we've been putting bike lanes in. We've done that through a bike action plan that the city put together. And that's not like an amazing concept. Cities all over are doing it. But again, finding ways to implement that. And this is where both the leaders at the council level saying, let's put together that bike action plan. But as important as that is to have that plan in place, again, having that constituency come together. And in the Southern California area and both the region at the MPO level as well as the county transportation level and at cities, you're seeing that confluence of people from biking, transit, and pedestrians coming together to be the advocates for it. So there's still, not every bike lane works, not every, you're going to have those bumps in the road, literally, but that's where you adjust and you keep moving forward with that vision and having the constituents there to say, this is what we want, and then measuring it. And what we've done, too, we can quote the statistics, how many bike miles lanes we've added, and how that has changed the mode. It's been dramatic, the number of people who are bicycling in Santa Monica and the region, and the demand for that. So again, being able to measure it, having those success stories, knowing you're going to have challenges, but that's what local government is always about, solving problems.
I love that example in part because it also demonstrates another kind of resilience. Do you remember that little thing in 2008? What was that? Oh, yeah, the global recession. It was a big natural experiment. Different communities, even in the same region, had very different outcomes. And one of the things that really struck me when I was a local official during that time is that in 2008, I began to see hundreds of cars drop off the DMV rolls in the District of Columbia because people could. They could dial down their transportation costs and still maintain their employment and their quality of life. And it meant, at the end of the day, very little foreclosure, very little default and bankruptcy. Some of those cars came back on the DMV rolls. Later, some never did. And so 3-car households became 2-car households. 2-car households became 1-car households. There are now more than 84% of all the households in the district have 1 or fewer cars. So it really helped that community. It helped the tax rolls of the local government. And it was a stark contrast to how other local governments in the same region, same housing and jobs market, had a very different experience. And so that's a way that cities can absolutely help places and households be more resilient.
Kate, have you had an experience on that front of seeing a differentiation between design or planning or economic development strategies that communities had used having an impact on how well they were or were not able to bounce back from some of these some of these impacts? Do we have that empirical evidence to kind of say, yeah, these are strategies that have made a difference for communities?
With our most recent recovery efforts, I think time will tell.
Yeah.
We'll have some really interesting test cases, and to your point, we should be monitoring those so that they can be used as models. But we have had the benefit of working in communities in various stages of recovery, which has provided a really interesting context. So we have some of our upstate communities who were devastated by Irene and Lee in 2011, who have already undergone some pretty substantial longer-term planning and recovery efforts, and then we came in and attempted to leverage those, not recreating the wheel, but refining different project concepts that were already proposed in previous planning cycles. So those communities, I think, were just a little further along and already had some more refined, at least concepts or strategies for achieving economic revitalization or resiliency down the road. But our communities now, who are on the heels of Sandy and still very much recovering, I think have started to propose some strategies that will have to be monitored and see how effective they were. And those really run the gamut from commercial corridor interventions that, help fortify small businesses, but also offer some streetscaping and TOD benefits and stormwater management. And this is being done in very vulnerable areas on the Rockaway Peninsula in New York City, for example, that can provide very real benefits for areas that have historically struggled economically. And we also are hearing from our small business communities the need for technical assistance in terms of understanding what their real risk is and understanding how to finance retrofits for their small businesses, physical retrofits. So we saw that proposed from our communities across many different regions, which has been interesting to take a step back now that we're done with our planning process to see where these themes are emerging on a regional scale and in completely dissimilar regions, to see where there's commonality in terms of existing unmet recovery and resilience needs. And our office also oversees a rather targeted small business recovery program where we've made about $26 million in grants to small businesses to help them recover. We also oversee a small business mentorship program, so we'll have to closely monitor, the results there to see if our goals really are achieved in terms of not only helping businesses to build back, but to achieve those co-benefits we spoke about and longer-term resiliency.
So we've been talking a bunch here as we've looked at some of the HUD National Disaster Resilience Competition, the work that you're doing in New York and so forth. We've been talking a lot about what to do in an instance where we're trying to bounce back from something that has happened, and we have an investment opportunity, perhaps there's even federal or state dollars to help out with that, and how can we ensure that those investments are done as intelligently as possible, both in terms of thinking about future states, future climate impacts, but also these multiple dimensions. Let's not rebuild the berm if we could have a park instead that would deliver similar resilience benefits, but these other dimensions as well. What about for all the folks out there who are representing communities or regions that are not in the position of, I just went through a disaster, or I have the good fortune to perhaps be, in a position to receive some new resources to try to rebuild or invest in new infrastructure? I'm here with the same old infrastructure and the same old plan that I've had. Is resilience an important concept for me, and how do I think about how do I go about thinking about that as a planning principle, and what opportunities are there for me in terms of really getting meaningful investment into that space? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I think it's funny that you're framing it that you didn't have the good luck to be slammed.
I did not say good luck. I'm not in the position of.
But I do actually think that. Believe me, your time will come. 2/3 of the counties in the U.S. had presidentially declared disasters in just the 3 years between 2011 and 2013. I mean, you're gonna see more of that, and one of the things that Kate was kind of referring to in some ways is that fortune favors the prepared mind. Mm-hmm. So planning in advance about what is it your community wants to do, where are you headed, what's your future, that helps you to respond in a disaster, but it also helps you, if you're, considering, God forbid, an Olympic bid or whatever it might be, whatever the opportunity might be that you might be trying to move toward. That is a terrible example, but you can imagine other opportunities that you might mobilize your community around. But resilience is really just an opportunity, to think differently about the future. And don't we all need to do that anyway? I mean, every major sector of the economy is at a huge inflection point. Right? Do we really think that straight-line projections from 40 years ago make sense 40 years in the future in transportation, in water and sewer, in telecommunications, in electricity generation and distribution? No, right? No. We might look back on our so-called infrastructure deficit and say that was a hugely great thing that we didn't invest when we would have invested in the wrong things. Maybe now we could invest in the right things. Going forward. I see Roger Millar is in the audience, and he's doing some amazing work with state DOTs around the country to say that 40-year-old bag of projects that you've been dragging around that are slowly working their way up to the top, let's not do that. Let's not fund those projects that way. Let's see if we can get you a faster, cheaper result that actually solves the problem that you're having, and not this thing that's been in the bag for 40 years, that a bypass or whatever that you probably don't really need. So I think any opportunity that we can create in our communities to take a fresh look at these things and to think differently about the future, plan with scenarios, because the future is nothing if not uncertain. So any one thing that we might do that's putting all of our chips on a single future path is probably not great. But if we have a project that works with 3 alternative futures, that's actually maybe a good project to be funding, something that's adaptable. One of the other projects in Rebuild by Design is in Hoboken, where it's partially a parking garage that could be funded today with parking revenue and help to support economic development. It's entirely underground, so it also can store vast quantities of storm surge and storm water. And, it's a park on the top. So it meets a lot of these different needs. It has a lot of different funding streams. Maybe that's the kind of infrastructure we should be thinking about. So resilience is one opportunity. The wake of a disaster is certainly a chance to look at this, but you're actually much better prepared if you can look before the disaster and know how you would strategically invest what, in some communities, frankly, is a windfall of money that they'll never see. For HUD itself, some years our disaster appropriation is bigger than the entire appropriation for the agency. That's how much money sometimes, moves through communities to do what? To do what you decide is the best thing to do with that money.
I think we're going to transition into our closing pretty soon, but just picking up on that and turning to you, Pam and Kate, do you feel like so yes, fortune favors the prepared. We need to be thinking about scenarios, but how good is the information, particularly when we think about climate risks, how good is the information, how good are the tools that we really have to think about those downscale futures, those downscale impacts that we're going to be grappling with in future, whether we're making a concerted investment post-disaster or whether we're just making investments in the normal cycle that we do. And this is a hobby horse for me, since it's a lot of what we think about at EPA, but I'm just curious to hear what you might say about the information and tools that we have as we think about those futures that we're supposed to be planning for.
Well, I think on the New York State level, part of the Community Risk and Resilience Act I had previously mentioned charges the Department of Environmental Conservation with developing new climate change projections, primarily sea level rise projections by 2016. And then those projections must be considered when specific states are making regulatory and permitting decisions. So the goal there is to first ensure that we do have the most up-to-date data, and I'm sure DEC will be leveraging resources within the state and also within the federal government, but I think there's, by and large, a paucity of investment in the necessary science that's needed to inform these decisions. But I think, as Harriet mentioned before, states are great rule makers. If we build it, they will come. If we mandate that states do invest in these projections and leverage other state and federal resources, I think that will catalyze more investment. And I think, to your previous question, the state as a rulemaker, I think, really does need to prioritize resilience in their typical competitive funding streams. And the state of New York is starting to do that. We have established regional economic development councils, which are now, I believe, in their third year, established by Governor Cuomo. And just this last cycle, projects that were deemed to have a resilient component or a resilient priority were given additional points in the distribution, the competitive distribution of state funding. So we can, we hope we will not be receiving future disaster appropriations. We do hope we will be receiving part of this national disaster funding process. But, it's really, as a rulemaker, baking in resilience as a key decision-making metric when we do have the opportunity to competitively make grants. And I think the RDC process is a good example of how that's starting to happen in New York, and I'm sure it's also happening in other states. But we first have to set that bar.
Yeah, that's great. And Pam, any reflections?
Well, I started out talking about the Sustainable City Plan that Santa Monica put together 20 years ago. And over the decade, 20-some years ago now, over the decades that's evolved. There have been different time points where things have been reassessed. That's where different dimensions were added. The affordable housing, civic engagement, human dignity added to that. Just recently we added arts and cultures because it has evolved to be, in a way, maybe a strategic plan for livability in the community, but still rooted in the sustainability and resilience. Now, how to engage the community on that? What we've done, our staff has developed very rigorous measures to be able to evaluate year by year how if we're achieving the goals. We set the goals, long-term vision, set the goals. And what we do is we report out to the community every 2 years on that with a report card. The simple concept of you get a grade on how you're doing. You identify, too. You don't step away from it. You say, okay, we got a C- on this one. Why? What were the obstacles? What were those obstacles that were internal to us that we can overcome? What are those obstacles that are external, that may be countywide, that we're not totally in control of? But even in that case, what are the kinds of things we would be doing to overcome that? Well, that report card and that reporting out has become so popular that it's basically a sellout breakfast in Santa Monica of community members and businesses coming when we roll out that report card. So that certainly engages the community and keeps us moving forward. On the same note, I want to add, for 20 years now, we've been doing a Sustainable Quality Awards with our Chamber of Commerce, and that's to recognize those businesses that are operating in a sustainable, green, environmentally conscious fashion, and that too has grown over the years. So we have, really an annual Sustainable Quality Awards, and then the every 2 years report card. And that, again, engages the public, keeps them involved. And you can get the tip of the iceberg information, which is what the average person wants. They don't need to get in the weeds. But if you want to get in the weeds, you can get onto the website. You can get more information on that. Now then, concurrently, our staff are doing that more kind of forward-thinking kinds of things, working with groups like Sea Grant, working with NOAA to look at what are the projections for storm surge, other kinds of things that might affect us in the future, so that we know what those impacts might be and what we need to do to build that resilience. And then in addition to that, we're working with UCLA students because we still have this concept of being a carbon neutral city down the road. But what we're looking at now with the UCLA students are what would be the impacts of being carbon neutral versus the impacts of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Are there differences there? So again, having and looking at those long-term kind of things, along with regularly reporting out and engaging the community on what we're doing now and what the next steps should be.
That's great. That sounds really fascinating. So I think we're getting the high sign here that we're headed into our last 4 or 5 minutes. So I want to give everybody a chance to kind of do some closing remarks, if you will, and maybe we'll go in reverse order and let you take the first crack at it, Pam. And I invite you to focus wherever you want. But one possible focus could be, what's the next big thing in resilience from where you sit? What should we be looking out to in the future in terms of a goal and a new focus here?
Well, I kind of led with that one.
Yeah,
so
right.
for my community,
Yeah.
it's that convergence of community well-being with the sustainable city. And we're in the middle of working on that, and we'll see where that goes. But I will say one of the points Harriet made was about who's a convener. And at our region, both the Metropolitan Planning Organization, the Regional Planning Agency, which does the transportation plan, but frankly they don't make laws. They do this big overarching planning, but they also have that role that they can be a convener on major topics. They can. Right now, SCAG is undertaking poverty because that is a big issue in Southern California. And let's face it, poverty and how people live, that impacts your day-to-day life, your resilience, and none of it else matters if you're not living a healthy life, you don't have access to education, health services, work, etc. So using that MPO, the regional planning organizations, or whatever that structure is, as a convener really helps the region. And then the other thing, the ongoing of being able to share those pilot programs that folks are doing, whether it's through nonprofit groups like Local Government Commission in California, whether it's through your regional MPO or a sub-regional organization, that get that toolkit, that toolbox of what has been done by a city. Because as you noted, there's that envy. And besides the envy, the average person will say, well, wow, I was just in community A, and wow, they have some great bike lanes. Or I was just in community B and saw this really cool park, and why don't we have that? So using the energy of people experiencing those things, seeing them, experiencing them, and then knocking on the door of their hometown saying, why don't we have this, really helps spread and change.
Great.
Change.
All right, fantastic. So a minute or two from each of you, and Kate and Harriet.
So in terms of the next big thing, I think we're going to see throughout the Northeast, largely thanks to Rebuild by Design, some very impactful best practices, some innovative scalable projects that can be replicated elsewhere. Not just what's happening in New York State, but also New Jersey's projects as well. But in a sense, that's already here. We are, I think, waking up and learning from our European brothers and sisters across the pond of what has worked well in terms of mitigating coastal risks and sea level rise, climate change projections. And I think we now have the political leadership and courage to pursue these big ideas and to fund these big ideas, which I think is immensely exciting. But at the same time, I wanted to pick up on the livability thread that Pam had introduced. When we embarked upon this community reconstruction planning process, I thought we would see primarily physical projects recommended by these communities, physical infrastructure projects. And we have a lot of those. We have some really exciting nature-based projects that are being proposed, some more traditional gray infrastructure projects that are necessary in certain areas. We have some economic development projects that I mentioned before. But I was struck by how profound this need for social resilience seems to be. And I think it's very much tied with the livability index and a lot of the work that has been happening within planning circles for a while. But when we took a step back and looked across the state of New York, vastly different communities in terms of needs and population and economic well-being, by and large, all of them identified a need for social resilience capacity building. How do we empower existing community-based organizations? How do we connect them to one another to be more prepared for the next event, but also to improve daily quality of life for those communities? We don't want to just prepare for the next event or respond to the past event, but to make investments that improve everyday quality of life. And I was really struck by, I think, how much work needs to be done in this social resiliency space. And I think there are some really exciting proposals and concepts emerging, but I predict that'll become a primary area of focus for planners and community development professionals working in this recovery and resiliency space.
Great, fantastic. Harriet, I think you got the last word here.
Okay. I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity to be here with such talented and inspiring leaders. It's been a very fun conversation to have with all of you. You can sort of see that alignment is a big deal. It's a key thing. So if you had federal, state, and local governments aligned around a set of issues, it's a very powerful thing. And a lot of money can be very strategically invested and deployed in a way that you can't possibly do if you don't have that alignment. So I think we're going to look to see more of that, but not just with government. So we're doing some innovative partnerships with Rockefeller around Rebuild by Design and around the national competition. But the same value proposition, a small investment at the front end to leverage a lot of physical money being spent in communities at the back end, that's a value proposition that works at every scale and throughout the country. So look to see more philanthropy engaged in these issues, but also insurance more engaged in helping to solve this problem. Mortgage banking, investment banking, that there's a real different value proposition with the kinds of things that we're talking about than how we've conventionally done it, and we're working to get more of that alignment. I totally agree with the social resilience issue, but I'm also thinking of it differently, almost like distributed networks instead of big centralized systems in government. So every one of you at your tables with your cell phones, you could be a mesh network. You could be a distributed network that could be autonomous of other entities. So in an emergency, your block might be, and the social cohesion on your block might make the difference in your apartment building between whether or not people get through the disaster or they don't. And so I think I also see a devolution, that would really help strengthen, the capacity of communities and engage people in a very different way, not just around disasters, but around other kinds of opportunities in places. And I look forward to seeing that evolve.
Yeah, that's really exciting to think about that social capital and building civic society, getting beyond bowling alone. Everybody, if we could just give a hand to our great panelists. I think this was a really fantastic